Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, Part 6. The Abyss of the Real. What is the abyss? Perhaps no other concept in the Thelemic tradition has been more superficially appropriated than Aleister Crowley's richly evocative mythopoetic imagery of the abyss, subsisting as the gap between the supernal triad and the lower Sephiroth on the Tree of Life. In the following discussion, I interpret the symbolism of the abyss as a complex metaphor for the ontological ultimacy of the Kabbalistic zero over, but not merely against, the phenomenon of mystical and magical unity, characteristic of the magical work associated with the middle valences of the tree, particularly the adept's Gnostic unification of psychological self-consciousness symbolized by Tifereth. Having stabilized themselves in this Sephira, the contemplation of the adept is now raised to Da'ath, and their search for a deeper understanding of the mysteries of the summit of the Tree of Life causes the problem deadlock signified by the ordeal of the abyss to assert itself more decisively. The magician's choice towards their basic spiritual orientation will now determine the ultimate trajectory of their orbit within the body of Nuid. The correspondence of the sun with Tifereth stands for the unification of the subject in and through the true will, communicated by the spirit presence of the holy guardian angel, as represented by the throned solar god form of Horus upon the stele of revealing. The starry body of Nuit stretched over the throne indicates the supernal night of the nothingness of the Kabbalistic zero established as the ontological horizon, within which the divine epiphany of the higher divine self discloses the meaning of their being to the magician. The abyssal void of space-time is the blackboard upon which unfolds the self-inscription of the world of phenomenal appearances. The abyss represents the factor infinite and unknown, L232, of the greater objective universe, transcending and conditioning the thereby necessarily incomplete totality expressed by Gnostic self-consciousness. The knowledge completed in Da'ath, according to this reading, concerns how contingent finitude is the materially insurmountable and therefore post-metaphysically absolute horizon of all phenomena. Our existence is necessarily temporally finite. Through constructively accepting their finitude, the magician remains open to continued psychological development. Otherwise, the attainment of gnosis fizzles and becomes static, canceling out the benefits gained from knowledge and conversation. By instead acknowledging and engaging with the limits imposed by their contingency, the magician achieves a maturity of perspective that opens deep access to the dimension of the drive, a space of psychological fulfillment in excess of the immediate satiation of libidinal desire based on the pleasure principle. The choice presented by the abyss is therefore between the identification of self-consciousness with the reality principle of the drive, which can accept and adapt to the historical quality of the horizon of being, or with the narcissistic withdrawal from reality into addictive fantasies facilitated by the pleasure principle. The former decision permits the psyche to continue its creative growth, while the latter choice is productive of neurotic solipsism and psychic vampirism. Because psychological overinvestment with the libidinal dynamic of the life instincts leads to narcissistic symptoms that stifle the psyche's growth, the libidinal dynamic should be balanced out with self-expression via the death instincts, so-called, which facilitate the social development of the psyche by permitting its affective identifications with non-immediate goals, projects, and values that require the self-discipline of desire within a historical experience that is always already both personal and collective in significance. The ordeal of the abyss expresses the psyche's struggle between narcissism and maturity, and its choice to identify itself either with the pleasure principle and the symptoms of addictive narcissism it sustains, or with the reality principle in a quest to fulfill its larger social historical destiny through the creative freedom of the death drive. In and through the negative limit imposed by the adept's personal finitude, access to an impersonal infinitude is opened in terms of the undead death drive, whose will to power insists beyond the extinction of libidinal desire. The life instincts value the infinity of extension, the indefinite immediate satisfaction of instinctual desires. However, language-using animals such as human beings have additional access to the infinity of the hermeneutical dimension of social self-relationality, the circuit of creative self-making that Hegel calls the being that is for itself, that is in turn the basis for spirit or Geist, the intersubjective medium of culture and history. For the choice represented by the crossing of the abyss to have meaning, there must be a coherently developed psychological self for whom such a choice is meaningful. On this theme, Crowley's pedagogical insistence that the magician first seek communion with the holy guardian angel before attempting the adventure of the abyss is instructive. By initially addressing their practice to the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, the magician comes to know who they are and what they are doing, and thereby possesses a clear and distinct sense of their true will. Until their basic equilibrium is stabilized around the gnosis of the true will, the mysteries of the abyss are at best a distraction from the work at hand, and at worst they provide the opportunity for a psychological breakdown that all too often ends further magical progress. This can be dramatic, manifesting as criminal behavior, mental illness, and even physical death, as when Jack Parsons famously blew himself up mixing explosives in his garage while high on amphetamines. More commonly, those who prematurely declare they have crossed the abyss and proclaim their enlightened mastery to all and sundry are simply cheating, claiming to have won a game they haven't fairly played. If, all too typically, the master refuses to practice magic anymore, it shouldn't be a surprise if they never accomplish anything again. The abyss is not inherently qliphothic because it represents nothingness, and nothingness is beyond the human-imposed dualism of good and evil that the qliphoth serves to symbolize. Nevertheless, the abyss definitely manifests qliphothic phenomenon to magicians who approach it without the maturity of practice to understand its deeper significance. The best way to achieve this maturity is to diligently pursue the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, while letting the abyss take care of itself on its own schedule. One will naturally follow the other over a period of personal growth spanning years or perhaps decades. From the supernal perspective of the Kabbalistic zero, the magician is headed nowhere in search of nothing, so there's no need to be in a hurry. On this quest, the journey is the destination, and when one reaches a destination, that just means that it's time to sally forth on another adventure. The understanding signified by the abyss and the supernal Sephiroth it conceals concerns the meaning of all the quests and the true identity of the quester. Meanwhile, the adventure called life continues. As a symbol of the negative quality of the Kabbalistic zero, the abyss is not a location on the astral plane or elsewhere, nor is it a state of consciousness that can be attained. Rather, its concept thematizes the formal horizon or ontological condition of the possibility that characterizes all the objects of experience in the states of our mind. The abyss names the absence-presence of Jacques Lacan's function of the real, representing the incompleteness of all systemic totalities, facilitating the dynamic nothingness that underlies all apparent unities, granting them life by giving them death. Understood in this light, the abyss is not really a separate domain from the supernals, but rather simply how the supernal triad looks when viewed from the perspective of the lower tree looking up. The abyss, therefore, really is the supernals, not an opposed principle. Similarly, the lower tree, representing the positive domain of being below the abyss, is really all still in the abyss. The quality of the abyss characterizes the ontology of all the lower Sephiroth, not simply their boundary limit or frontier. Likewise, the ontological incompleteness represented by the abyss stands for the status of the whole tree of life in terms of the ultimacy of the Kabbalistic zero. It follows that the abyss is not bad, and that it therefore does not have a primary correspondence to the qliphoth at all. The qliphoth is better thematized as a surplus dimension of the tree emerging from an excess of Geburah, the Sidra Akra or other side of the positive tree, and as the domain of shadowy partial existences lying below Malkut. The latter comprises the astral shells dwelling within those aspects of the lowest Sephiroth that are disconnected from receiving adequate influx from the higher levels of the tree. The obsessive emphasis on the qliphonic interpretation of the abyss found in some contexts derives more from the writings of Kenneth Grant than from Crowley's usage of the concept, and certainly does not come from the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition. Grant's Typhonian interpretation of Thelema, while influential, has also worked to obscure and distort Crowley's own more complex and nuanced mythopoetic conception of the abyss, which magically concerns the constructive transcendence of the conventional sense of the personal self in a creatively therapeutic manner that only the unenlightened would consider evil. Indeed, there is no abyss situated between Bina and Chokmah in the originally Jewish Kabbalah. That is to say, between Bina and Chokmah in the lower part of the tree. Instead, there is sometimes represented an 11th Sephirah called Da'ath, meaning knowledge, that mediates the gap between the upper and middle levels of the tree, and its function is generally described positively. For example, Chaim Vital, in his Etz Chaim, discusses how the Nefesh avoids obsession from the Qliphoth by withdrawing into the heart during sleep, instead of remaining suffused throughout the body, as is normal during waking hours. Vital cites Proverbs 19:2, "The soul, Nefesh, without knowledge, Da'at, is not good." The Nefesh, in other words, needs communication with the active mentality of the Ruach, which culminates in Da'ath, to avoid obsession. Vital writes, "The shells can attach themselves to the lower level of the tree when the middle level, the Ruach, is absent." In this passage, therefore, Da'ath acts as an antidote to the Qliphoth and not as its primary expression. In a Jewish textual context, the abyss is more generally a reference to the Tohu Bohu, the primordial waters of creation as described in the opening passages of Genesis, which resolve themselves after the 7 days of creation into the space of the heavens with the earth in its midst. The first book of the Sefer Yetzirah opens with a description of the abyss of height and depth, within which the divine mysteries of creation unfold. Verse 5 reads, "The 10 spheres, Sephiroth, of no thing, Belima, have 10 vast regions bound unto them, boundless in origin and having no end, an abyss of good and of evil, an abyss of height and of depth, an abyss to the east and to the west, an abyss to the north and to the south." The description of the Sephiroth as Belima is especially interesting given the Kabbalistic tradition's similar characterization of the divine as Ayin, a cognate term for nothingness. Arya Kaplan, in his commentary of the Sefer Yetzirah, identifies the only use of this word Belima in the Hebrew scriptures as occurring in Job 26:7. Quote, "He," that is to say God, "hangs the earth on nothingness," Belima. Noting further that, quote, "the word Belima is derived from the two words belly, meaning without, and ma, meaning what or anything. The word Belima would then mean without anything or nothingness." The Lurianic tradition further radicalizes these motifs with the narrative of Simsum, the primordial evacuation whereby the unmediated presence of the divine has always already withdrawn itself from the abyssal space of creation, such that the sacred presence of God is mystically encountered in and through the absence of God. For the Jewish Kabbalist, God's absence serves as an allegory for the exiled status of the Jewish community after the destruction of the temple. What Luria's reading does is to extend the condition of exile to the whole universe by folding the theme of exile into the creation narrative in Genesis. Therefore, the Jewish Kabbalistic concept of divine nothingness stands at an interpretive distance to the superficially similar idea of nothingness in the Greek metaphysical tradition, whose standard Platonic concept of divine nothingness typically indicates an apophatic unity standing in a harmoniously hierarchical relationship to the cosmos. Recall that the ancient Greeks had no mathematical concept of zero, so nothing is read as if it were a kind of unity. In contrast, Isaac Luria's interpretation of the primordial fall grasps how the divine is fractured and out of joint with the universe, and so, correspondingly, the organic hierarchical ordering of the universe is likewise broken, such that the orphan and the outcast receive election, and the last become first, a major theme throughout the Torah tradition, from the myths of the patriarchs to the pseudo-Messiah Rabbi Joshua's Sermon on the Mount. There are a number of affinities between Kabbalah and Gnosticism. In ancient times, both cultural discourse systems maintained an antinomian distance towards the dominant pagan and later imperial Christian society. Jews, for example, considered the Roman civic temple sacrifices to be a form of idolatry prescribed by Torah, and they therefore commonly refrained from participating in them. Gnosticism likewise thought that civic religion worshipped a false god, sometimes called Yaldabaoth, a corruption of Yahweh, who had usurped the place of the true God. Both traditions therefore resisted assimilation of the reigning social-political status quo and remained apart from public worship. Likewise, on the far end of the Middle Ages, at the advent of modernity, both traditions regained contemporary relevance as the hegemony of Christian colonialism began its slow process of decomposition, and their once censored content became more widely disseminated. Indeed, something like the secular atheism we now experience as a cultural norm in postmodern consumer culture first found its modern expression in the Jewish community during the Enlightenment, particularly in cosmopolitan Protestant cities such as Amsterdam. Baruch Spinoza was perhaps the first atheist in a fully modern sense. It is not coincidental that later such quintessentially modern thinkers as Freud and Marx were secular Jews. Their social position aslant the surrounding Christian culture facilitated their critique of the cultural legacy of Christian colonialism. Eventually, this critical tendency comes full circle in the work of Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, and others, who revived the study of Hasidic and Kabbalistic texts and traditions that had been largely forgotten by bourgeois assimilated Enlightenment Jews in Western Europe, who considered them backwards and superstitious. Scholem and Buber were interested in the Kabbalah not because they believed in God, but rather because the Kabbalah offers a discourse system whose interpretive valences speak to the modern condition, by providing novel strategies for rereading the cultural inheritance of the past in accord with the conditions of modern alienation, wherein the theme of cosmic exile insists with a renewed urgency at both a personal and communal level. I would argue that Aleister Crowley's psychological reading of the Kabbalah in terms of the dynamic, creative nothingness of being constructively intersects with the hermeneutical priorities of the modern Jewish Kabbalistic revival. Both interpretive contexts address the death of God in modern experience and therefore deploy the Kabbalah independently of any metaphysical underpinnings as a set of hermeneutical reading strategies to reopen textual traditions that were assumed closed. For Jewish readers of Scholem, Buber, and others, these traditions were those of the Hasidim and their medieval predecessors, while for Crowley, these are the traditions of magic, theurgy, Hermeticism, alchemy, tarot, Rosicrucianism, etc., culminating in the mysteries of the abyss. In the chapter Man in Little Essays Towards Truth, Aleister Crowley writes, "The triune principle of the supernals, being wholly spiritual, all that can be said about it is really negative, and it is complete in itself. Beyond it stretches what is called the abyss. In the abyss, all things exist, indeed, at least in posse, that is to say, in potential, but are without any possible meaning, for they lack the substratum of spiritual reality. They are appearances without law. They are thus insane delusions. Now the abyss, being thus the great storehouse of phenomena, is the source of all impressions," unquote. Crowley's description of the abyss as the great storehouse of phenomenon, the source of all impressions, should be compared with his brief remark at the beginning of the vision of the 10th ether, the vision of the voice, that, quote, "There is no being in the outermost abyss, but constant forms come forth from the nothingness of it," unquote. In other words, the abyss corresponds to the Platonic realm of forms, the storehouse of souls which, according to Neoplatonic doctrine, give shape to the otherwise inchoate prime matter of the cosmos, establishing the appearances of the world. However, as noted by Plato in the Republic and elsewhere in his writings, these appearances are necessarily imperfect manifestations of the spiritual forms. Semiotically interpreted, the storehouse of all impressions of phenomenon is, of course, language, in and through which the human experience of the world is socially constructed. While for Plato and his Neoplatonic successors the forms are supernatural, the function of the forms can just as well, if not significantly better, be conceived linguistically. Accordingly, the transcendental hermeneutical horizon that establishes the coordinates of the world intelligibility of being can be theorized as a function of the imaginary in terms of the prevailing cultural symbolic order. Thus, the crossing of the abyss is equivalent to the inversion onto the imaginary, which corresponds to Bina, whose understanding is the quest of the authentic master of the temple. For we should remember that Choronzon is defeated at the conclusion of the vision of the 10th ether, whose preface declares, "In nomine Babylon, amen, restriction unto Choronzon," interpreting restriction in terms of L141, the word of sin is restriction. And this leads me to read this exhortation as an identification of Choronzon with restriction, which is to be overcome through the understanding of Babylon Bina, realized through the Gnostic release of the dimension of the death drive through the therapeutic, not psychotic, inversion onto the imaginary. In Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge is a spiritual entity separate and distinct from the realm of forms. In an elaborate metaphor, the dialogue depicts the demiurge riding in a chariot, sowing the seeds of the soul forms of material objects over the fallow field of the prime matter of the cosmos. Centuries later, Plotinus's Enneads systematize and elaborate Plato's themes, founding the tradition subsequently called Neoplatonism. Plotinus conflates the demiurge and the realm of forms into a single spiritual being, posited as the first emanation of a transcosmic one. Since the one is perfect, Plotinus reasons, it cannot act to create the cosmos, as such an action would involve the one in the imperfections of material reality, and thus stain the purity of the one. Therefore, it is the demiurge which acts to impart the forms of the cosmos from the summit of being. While for Plotinus the demiurge is good, because the world it creates is fundamentally good, although its material quality is not good. Typically, for the Gnostic traditions in late antiquity, most notably the Sethians, the world is not as a whole good, as it is for the more politically endorsed versions of the Platonic tradition, and therefore the world-making function of the demiurge takes on a negative, even evil aspect. It is this villainous Gnostic characterization of the demiurge that provides the literary basis for the figure of Choronzon in Crowley's mythology. However, Crowley's designation of Choronzon as a devil should not confuse its deeper symbolic significance. Recall that the devil, Satan or Lucifer, is depicted in a uniformly positive light in the vision and the voice. It is further identified with Aiwass, Crowley's own holy guardian angel, whose voice is the author of the Book of the Law. So, excluding the character of Satan from consideration, who is Choronzon? The Gnostic name for the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, is derived from Yahweh, identified as the false exoteric god worshipped by public civic religion. The Gnostic initiate instead worships the true hidden god Iao, a word also derived from Yahweh. In a similar manner, I would propose that the name Choronzon hides the name Christ, the name of the false god worshipped by the world, the overthrow of whose rule is signified by the new eon. Part of the magical formula signified by Crowley's possession by Choronzon is that in crossing the abyss, the magician must take the place of Choronzon, defeating him and becoming the new demiurge of their own magical universe in a new positive sense. In other words, they must root out the Christian colonial imaginary imposed on them by their initial socialization and work to replace it with a refreshed and renewed horizon of being, liberated from the oppressive ideological baggage of the old eon. Further, the theme of the real as the incompleteness of language explains the chaotic quality of the abyss, based on Crowley's description of how, quote, In the abyss, all things exist without any possible meaning, for they lack the substratum of spiritual reality. They are appearances without law. They are thus insane delusions, unquote. If human social language usages provide a necessary material basis for the construction of the intersubjective life world within which we move and live and have our being, then it follows that the pluriverse of meanings within the life world have no metaphysical grounding. All signification is contingent and could mean otherwise, and there is no absolute standard to fix the possible meanings of language. Language is therefore open to endless permutation, infinite in and through its very finitude, eternally open to further signification in and through its bounded historicity, forever productively structuring the ideal virtual appearances of the life world in and through the social materiality of the symbolic order. From the ultimately false perspective of the metaphysical unity, the appearances generated by the linguistic imaginary are insane delusions, because the condition of the real ensures that the relation between sign and meaning, signifier and signified is interpretive, and therefore deprived of metaphysical grounding. Therefore, all linguistic signification consists in appearances without law, lacking any ontotheological warrant. Under these abyssal conditions, the magician must take the place of the demiurge, so that for the sake of love there might be a new heaven and a new earth. Then the will to power of the creative death drive, magically manifested in the authenticity of the true well, shall reinscribe the conditions of the world. Love is the law, love under will.